The year is 2006. Microsoft's Xbox 360 has been on the market for a few months, and Sony's PS3 and Nintendo's Wii were still more than half a year from being released. In fact, Nintendo still hadn't even revealed the actual name of the Wii yet. Everyone just knew it by its codename, Revolution. And despite already knowing several things about it, such as its appearance, that it would have a unique controller, and it would not support HD resolutions, there were still many questions surrounding the mysterious console. Like, just how good would third-party games look? And what kind of experiences could they create on Nintendo's platform to take advantage of its new controller? One company decided to step up and answer those questions with an ambitious game unlike anything that had come before it. That company was Ubisoft. And the game was Red Steel. In this edition of Beating the Backlog, we'll go back to the game's reveal and look at how it tried to convince skeptical gamers that this was the dawn of a new era. Then we'll take a look at the final product and see whether or not it lived up to those promises. And finally, we'll look at how it holds up today, the best way you can experience it now, and if that changes anything. So sit back and relax as we hack, slash, and shoot our way through a look at the notorious Wii launch title. In early 2006, we still had a lot to learn about Nintendo's upcoming console we now know as the Wii. Namely, what would its third-party games look like? If you weren't around then, it's important to know that Nintendo was kind of on the ropes at that point, at least here in America. The GameCube, while it had a great overall library, just didn't sell very well, and toward the end of its life, many third-party publishers had actually stopped actively supporting it. Awesome games like Burnout 3 and Revenge and Black from EA, Dark Watch from Capcom, Grand Theft Auto titles, the list goes on, just didn't ever appear on the GameCube. So when we learned that there was going to be a huge power gap between Nintendo and its competitors in the upcoming generation, people were eager to find out just how games would look on the Nintendo console. Red Steel made its debut in the May 2006 issue of Game Informer, and these screenshots gave us our first glimpse at the next generation for Nintendo. In addition to the screenshots though, we also got our first tidbits of what to expect story and gameplay wise. And that too sounded pretty promising. You play as Scott, a bodyguard, whose fiancée is kidnapped by the Yakuza, and you take matters into your own hands to get her back. Your journey would see you taking part in sword fights, shootouts, and more, all with unmatched interactivity thanks to Nintendo's revolutionary controller. It definitely sounded ambitious, and it looked great, and I couldn't wait to see it in action. So skip ahead a few weeks to E3, and this is what we were shown. These kind of trailers would become a staple of early marketing for the Wii, full of laughable moments like players diving behind their furniture and multiplayer matches on uncomfortably crowded couches. It was an interesting time, but the thing that stood out most was the gulf in quality between those first screenshots and the actual game on actual televisions. This is gameplay from the floor at E3 in 2006. As you can see, there was a reason the marketing did not focus on full-screen video of the game itself, but rather people playing it or pretending to. There were also reports that the game's controls just didn't feel that great. Still, the game piqued my interest enough that I plopped down the money for a pre-order to be able to experience it myself that coming November. Over the next few months, we got more trailers featuring the same goofy concept, you gotta hand it to these actors, and then came launch day. Time to find out just how truthful all the marketing and pre-release media was. Also, for the sake of this video, I'll only be focusing on the single-player aspects of this game. Right from the start, you can see just how determined Ubisoft was to get their money's worth out of that marketing campaign. The demo video on the actual disc is one of those trailers. Nice. Once you get past that, the Wii Remote's unique capabilities are immediately put to use. The IR pointer is used to navigate the menus, and when you first get into the game, a tutorial in the form of ridiculous dialogue from your fiancé
Oh, look at these fish, Scott. Aren't they pretty?
shows you how pointing to the edges of the screen turns the camera.
And this one on the extreme right, see?
This is actually a pretty important thing in the Wii's history, because this game pioneered that control scheme. Well, sort of. You see, Nintendo themselves had actually reportedly shown off a build of Metroid Prime 2 in 2005 that was rigged to work with pointer controls. But this is the first actual retail game to use that control scheme. And it was a great idea, when given the proper customization. You see, the game only gave the player 3 presets when it came to the camera sensitivity, and it did not give any option to change things like dead zone. As a result, you're stuck with 3 settings that each have a gigantic dead zone and horrible turning speed, and this makes it rather difficult to turn smoothly. Thus, you often end up pointing wildly around the screen throughout the game in an effort to straighten out your view so you can shoot your enemies. Regardless though, the act of actually pointing at the screen and pulling a trigger is only matched by light gun games, which had largely become a thing of the past by this point, and that alone adds a lot. As for the game itself, it actually isn't too bad, but it suffers in some key areas. First, the motion controls aren't very accurate, meaning the sword fights are not very engaging. In the trailers, they looked really dramatic and tense, but in the final product, because the Wii Remote's capabilities are very limited, your slashes often don't match up with the direction you're actually swinging. So more often than not, you just parry and slash a couple times and rinse and repeat. Now that's not to say these encounters can't be fun, but to say I found them disappointing would be an understatement. Another problem is the game's performance. It runs on Unreal Engine 2.5 because the developer Ubisoft Paris were familiar with it. Now I don't know if they just tried to do too much with the Wii's underpowered hardware or what, but the frame rate is absolutely abysmal most of the time. During my recent replay, I was struggling to hit enemies and time sword slashes properly because everything was so choppy, so I wanted to see just how bad the frame rate gets. I ran a few minutes of gameplay footage through a frame rate analysis tool, and this is what I found. The game targets 30 frames per second, but is often locked at 20, and it even dips well below that at some pretty crucial times. Needless to say, this game does not perform very well. That said though, there are some positives. I find the art style to be pretty appealing, and for a launch title, I think it looks pretty nice. The story is pretty one-note, the voice acting is for the most part poor.
Alright then, if this is all I mean to that ungrateful jerk, I don't owe him a damn thing.
But it has a certain campiness to it that kinda heightens the experience overall for me. It also tried some other pretty interesting things with the controls, like this ability to freeze time and target enemies individually. You can even shoot the guns from their hands for a non-lethal solution, including the ability to target the leader of the pack and get their entire squad to surrender at once. Then there's the soundtrack, which is actually pretty great. Composed by Tom Salta, whose resume includes a ton of games, including the Ghost Recon series, Crackdown, and most recently Wolfenstein Youngblood, it features some really high-quality production value and does a great job at setting the tone for each stage. It's also dynamic, so enemy encounters sound completely different from when you're just walking through a hallway. It's pretty cool stuff, and you'll find a link to a playlist for it in the description below. One thing that definitely stands out about the game, though, is despite the cover art itself having a bloody sword on it, and the game being called Red Steel, there is no blood, at least not from the enemies you face. It seems Ubisoft wanted a teen rating in hopes of reaching a bigger audience. As I'll touch on in a second, that may have worked, but it's still one of the strangest contradictions I've ever seen in a game. Ultimately, Red Steel is really a mixed bag, and that's reflected by its review scores. It has a 63 on Metacritic and an overall reputation of being sort of a letdown. That said, it's still reportedly sold over 1 million copies, so it wasn't a complete failure, but I think it's safe to say it never really quite lived up to the hype. I mean, aside from the novel controls, it really wasn't anything special design-wise. Its stages are incredibly linear, its AI, which was touted as being modeled after the amazing game Fear — the AI in Fear is still some of the best ever by the way, was surprisingly bland, though it's aggressive and does move around a fair bit, and the game's frame rate was all over the place. There's also the issue of how it dwells in unflattering stereotypes.
Hey man, when they told me I'd see some action in this place, I thought they just meant with the girls.
And nonsensical stuff like guys fighting you one-on-one wielding a baseball bat like a sword. I could go on. So should you bother playing it all these years later? Well, if you're really curious, there is one way you may want to consider playing it, but it comes with a huge catch. For years now, the emulator called Dolphin has been one of the biggest success stories in the world of emulation. It is compatible with nearly all GameCube and Wii games, lets you not only run those games in higher resolutions, but also sometimes at higher frame rates, and it even has support for things like custom textures, 3D, and VR. So I thought I'd try my luck and see what, if any, improvements can be made to Red Steel. And boy was I surprised. This is the game running on native hardware. This is the game at 4x internal resolution with 4x MSAA and a hack to let it run at 60 frames per second. Now, it isn't a stable 60 FPS, I do get occasional drops, and there is some bad microstutter every so often, but on the whole, this is a dramatically improved experience. My frustrations with aiming were cut to a minimum, and the timing of parries and slashes while sword fighting were much more tolerable. And most shockingly, I think the art style really holds up at these higher resolutions. Yeah, the textures are low res, but some are surprisingly detailed, and if you can believe it, playing the game like this actually looks astonishingly close to those original bull shots, which I honestly never thought would be possible. So if you have a good gaming PC, and that's a huge caveat, I know, and you have the means of ripping your own copy, definitely try this game out. There is a fun game to be found here, but you need to have the hardware to iron out the technical issues in order to fully appreciate it. In summary, the ambition of Red Steel remains undeniable. To be the first at something completely new is both exciting and terrifying. You had the chance to either set a new standard, fail miserably, or just get some things right and wrong, and sink away unnoticed, forgotten in time. This game falls more into that latter category, but Ubisoft Paris should still be commended for having the guts to take on an exclusive project for an unproven concept from a company that had been struggling in recent years. And love it or hate it, Red Steel did kick off what would be a pretty good genre for the Wii. Without it, we might not have even gotten stuff like the awesome Metroid Prime trilogy, and for that, at the very least, I'm grateful it exists. On the next Beating the Backlog, new look, new approach, Ubisoft puts plans for a Red Steel sequel into motion and gets a lot more right this time.